When I was 38, my parents kicked me out after living in their house for exactly 63 days following my divorce and a workplace injury that left me temporarily unable to work. They told me I had 48 hours to get out because they weren't running a homeless shelter. My brother James had been living there for 13 years at that point, playing video games in the basement and having mom do his laundry every single day. Let me paint you the full picture here because this story gets so much worse and I need you to understand exactly what kind of people we're dealing with. James moved back home when he was 22 after dropping out of college for the third time. The man spent every single day from 2008 to 2021 in that basement playing World of Warcraft and whatever other games were popular. Mom would bring him meals on a tray. Dad would slip him spending money for Steam games and energy drinks. When neighbors asked about James, Dad would say he was finding himself and exploring his creative side. When they asked about his job prospects, Mom would say he was too intelligent for regular work and needed time to discover his calling. Meanwhile, I graduated college, got married, worked 60-hour weeks at a construction management firm for 15 years, bought a house, and generally did everything you're supposed to do as a functional adult. I visited my parents every Sunday for dinner, helped Dad with yard work, took Mom grocery shopping when she needed it, and basically played the role of the good son who had his life together. Then everything fell apart in the span of 3 months. My wife Jessica left me for her personal trainer after I discovered she'd been seeing him for over a year. During the divorce proceedings, I fell off a scaffold at work and messed up my back badly enough that I couldn't do physical work for several months. The workers' compensation payments weren't enough to cover my mortgage and living expenses, especially with lawyer fees eating through my savings. I had to sell the house and move out before the bank took it. I called my parents and explained the situation. I asked if I could stay in my old bedroom for a few months while I recovered and got back on my feet. Dad said, of course, family helps family. And Mom started making plans for how nice it would be to have me home again. I figured I'd be there maybe 3 months maximum, get healed up, find a new position, and get my own place. The first week went fine. I helped around the house as much as I could with my back situation, did dishes, cleaned the kitchen, tried to be useful, but I quickly realized James had turned into some kind of protected species in that house. This man would sleep until 2 in the afternoon, come upstairs in his underwear to raid the refrigerator, grunt at whoever was around, and disappear back downstairs with armloads of food. He hadn't had a job in over a decade. He didn't pay rent, utilities, groceries, car insurance, or anything else. He drove their old Honda to GameStop and back. That was the extent of his contribution to society. I tried talking to Dad about it one evening while we were watching the news. I mentioned that maybe James should be looking for work now that the economy was picking up. Dad immediately got defensive and said James was going through a difficult period and needed family support. I pointed out that James had been going through this difficult period since the Obama administration, and maybe it was time for some tough love. Dad told me I was being jealous and small-minded. The real problem started in my second month there. I was finally able to do some light work and had started interviewing for project management positions. I was optimistic about my prospects and had even gotten a second interview with a firm that did commercial development. I made the mistake of talking about this progress at dinner one night, mentioning that I hoped to be out of their hair soon and back to being independent. Mom looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before and said I seemed awfully eager to abandon them again. She said it was interesting how I only came around when I needed something and then couldn't wait to leave. Dad jumped in and said at least James appreciated what they did for him and didn't treat their home like a hotel. I was confused because I'd been nothing but grateful and had tried to help out constantly despite my physical limitations. Things got worse over the next few weeks. Every conversation became a comparison between me and James, and somehow James always came out looking better. When I got up early to make coffee and breakfast for everyone, Mom would comment that James never made a mess in the kitchen because he was considerate enough to keep his food downstairs. When I vacuumed the living room, Dad would mention that James never tracked dirt through the house because he respected their space. The breaking point came when I got a job offer. A really good job offer, actually, with a salary higher than what I'd been making before. I was excited to tell them the news and figured they'd be happy that their son was getting back on his feet. I announced it at dinner, explaining that I'd be able to move out within 2 weeks and get my own apartment. Mom put down her fork and stared at me. She said she was tired of pretending everything was fine when I was clearly bringing negative energy into their home. She said divorced people were cursed and I was infecting their peaceful environment with my failure. Dad nodded and said I needed to understand that James had chosen to stay home because he valued family, while I had chosen to get married and ruin my life, and now I expected them to clean up my mess. I tried to defend myself, pointing out that divorce happens to good people and that I was trying to rebuild. Dad cut me off and said James helped around the house in ways I couldn't see, while I was just a pathetic failure who couldn't keep a marriage together or maintain my health. Mom added that maybe if I wasn't such a loser, my wife wouldn't have left me for someone better. That's when Dad delivered the line that I think about every single day. He said they weren't running a homeless shelter and I needed to pack my things and get out within 48 hours. He said my money was no good there because they didn't want me around. Period. Failed marriage, failed life, failed man. Then he looked me directly in the eyes and said when I came crawling back dying and desperate, I shouldn't bother knocking because they only housed winners in their home. I packed my stuff the next morning while James watched TV downstairs, completely unbothered by the family drama happening above his head. As I loaded my car, several neighbors came over to see what was happening. Mom made sure to explain loudly that they'd had to kick me out because they couldn't stand the sight of what I'd become. She told Shirley from next door that I'd been mooching off them and bringing my bad energy around their peaceful home. I drove away and haven't spoken to them since. That was 4 years ago. But here's where this story takes a turn that I've been planning for every single day since I left their driveway. I didn't just disappear and lick my wounds. I took that job and worked like a man possessed. I saved every penny, lived in the cheapest apartment I could find, and built my career back up strategically. Within 2 years, I was making more money than I'd ever made in my life. Within 3 years, I had my own consulting firm specializing in commercial construction project management. And I kept tabs on my family the whole time. Not because I missed them, but because I knew this day would come eventually. James is still living in that basement at 39 years old. Dad retired, and his pension isn't covering all their expenses the way they thought it would. Mom's health has been declining, and she needs more care than Dad can provide at home. Last week, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but somehow knew I'd been waiting to see for years. Update 1. Holy hell, Reddit. The phone conversation I've been waiting 4 years for finally happened, and it was exactly what I expected and somehow still managed to piss me off even more than I thought possible. So Dad calls me last Tuesday night, around 8 p.m. I almost didn't answer because I was genuinely busy reviewing contracts for a major retail development project, but then I realized this was the moment I'd been preparing for. I let it ring a few more times just because I could, then picked up with the most neutral voice I could manage. Dad starts off trying to sound casual, asking how I'm doing, saying it's been too long since we talked, acting like we had some minor disagreement 4 years ago, instead of him literally throwing me out of the house and telling neighbors I was a pathetic failure. I just listened and waited for him to get to the real reason he was calling. It took him about 5 minutes of awkward small talk before he finally admitted they were having some financial difficulties. Mom's health issues have gotten worse and she needs daily care now, but the care costs are way higher than they anticipated. Dad's pension isn't stretching as far as they thought it would with inflation, and they're having trouble making ends meet. He said they've been thinking about me a lot lately and realized they might have been too harsh back when I was going through my divorce. Too harsh. That's how he described throwing me out on the street and telling the entire neighborhood I was a cursed failure who infected their home with negative energy. But here's where it gets really rich. Dad then launches into this whole speech about how family is the most important thing, and how they've always been proud of me deep down. He said they heard through some mutual acquaintances that I was doing well in business now, and they thought maybe I'd like to come around for dinner sometime, patch things up, maybe talk about how we could all help each other during these challenging times. I let him finish his entire pitch before I responded. I told him I appreciated the call and that I was indeed doing very well professionally. I mentioned that my consulting firm had grown significantly, and I was now handling projects worth millions of dollars. I said it was interesting that he brought up family being important because I'd actually been thinking a lot about family dynamics over the past few years. Dad got excited hearing this and started talking faster, saying he knew I'd understand that families go through rough patches, but the important thing is sticking together when times get tough. He said James was still living at home and helping out around the house, and wouldn't it be nice if I could come home too, and we could all be together again? That's when I asked him to clarify something for me. I said I wanted to make sure I understood the family dynamics correctly. So could he remind me exactly what James contributes to the household financially and domestically? There was a long pause before Dad said, James helps in his own ways, and not everything valuable can be measured in dollars. I told him that was fascinating because I'd been doing a lot of research lately into property records and public financial information, and I'd discovered some interesting facts about their situation that I thought we should discuss openly if we were really going to rebuild our family relationship. Dad's tone changed immediately. He asked what I meant by research, and I could hear the defensiveness creeping into his voice. I explained that when you work in construction and development, you learn how to access all kinds of property and financial records, and I'd gotten curious about how they were managing their expenses with Dad's retirement and Mom's medical needs. I told him I knew their house was mortgaged for about 60% of its current value, which surprised me since I thought they'd paid it off years ago. I mentioned that I'd also noticed they'd taken out a substantial home equity line of credit about 18 months ago. Dad started interrupting me, saying I had no business looking into their private affairs. I cut him off and said actually, I had every right to research the financial stability of people who might be asking me for money, which is clearly where this conversation was heading. I said if we were going to talk about family helping family, then we needed to be completely honest about everyone's situation. Dad tried to deny they were asking for money, but I told him to save it. I said I knew exactly why he was calling, and I wanted him to understand that I wasn't the same desperate, broken man they'd kicked out 4 years ago. I explained that I'd spent this entire time building my career specifically, so that I would be in a position of strength when this day came, because I always knew it would come. That's when Dad's mask really started slipping. He said I was being petty and vindictive, and that holding grudges was no way to live. He said they'd made mistakes, but so had I, and mature people forgive each other and move forward together. I asked him to specify exactly what mistakes I'd made that justified throwing me out during the lowest point of my life while continuing to support a grown man who hadn't worked in over a decade. Dad got angry and said I was twisting things around, that James had never caused them the stress and problems that I did. He said James was grateful for their support and showed them respect, while I'd always been demanding and ungrateful. I asked him how James had shown respect by living in their basement for 13 years without contributing anything to the household. Dad said James contributes in ways I couldn't understand because I'd never valued family the way James does. He said James chose to stay home and be close to them instead of running off to get married and ruin his life like I did. He said at least James had never brought shame on the family by getting divorced and injured and needing to be rescued. I told Dad that was exactly the kind of thinking that had brought them to where they are now. I said they'd spent so many years enabling James and pretending his complete failure to launch was somehow noble, that they'd created a situation where their household had no financial stability when they needed it most. I pointed out that they had a 40-year-old son living in their basement who couldn't help them even if he wanted to because he has no money, no skills, and no experience in the real world. Dad started yelling then, saying James wasn't a failure and I was being cruel and judgmental. He said James was going through a difficult time and needed family support, not criticism from someone who'd abandoned them for years. I asked him exactly how long this difficult time was supposed to last, since it was approaching its 15th year. Mom got on the phone at that point, and her voice was shakier than I remembered, but just as manipulative as ever. She said she was disappointed in how cold and calculating I'd become, and that success had clearly changed me for the worse. She said the son she raised would never talk to his parents this way, and maybe my ex-wife had been right to leave me if this was the kind of man I'd turned into. I told Mom that was rich, coming from someone who'd told the entire neighborhood I was cursed and infectious. I said I found it interesting how quickly she'd gone from being unable to stand the sight of what I'd become to wanting to rebuild our relationship now that they needed financial help. Mom started crying and said they'd been wrong to say those things, but they were scared and overwhelmed at the time. She said they'd always loved me and just wanted their family back together. I told her that love doesn't involve calling your child a pathetic failure and telling neighbors you had to kick them out because you couldn't stand looking at them. Dad took the phone back and his voice was different now, more desperate. He said fine, they'd made mistakes, but that was in the past and we needed to focus on moving forward. He said they were family, and families forgive each other and help each other through tough times. He asked if I was really going to punish them forever for some things they said when emotions were running high. I told Dad I wasn't punishing anyone. I said I was simply a successful businessman who'd been contacted by people asking for money, and I was evaluating whether they were good candidates for my assistance. I said based on their track record of financial decision-making and their treatment of people who'd tried to help them in the past, I was having trouble seeing them as a sound investment. Dad went quiet for a long moment, then asked what I wanted from them. I told him I wanted complete honesty about their financial situation, and I wanted a detailed plan for how they intended to solve their problems long-term, not just get bailed out temporarily. I said if they were serious about rebuilding our relationship, they needed to demonstrate that they understood how badly they'd screwed up and what they were prepared to do differently. Dad said they could talk about all of that, but first, couldn't I just help them get through this immediate crisis? I asked him what James was doing to help with the immediate crisis. Dad said James was doing what he could, but his options were limited. I told Dad that was exactly the problem, and until they addressed the James situation, I couldn't see how throwing money at their problems would accomplish anything except enabling their dysfunction for a few more months. The conversation ended with Dad saying he'd talk to Mom and James and they'd figure out a plan, And could we meet in person soon to discuss everything face to face? I told him I'd consider it, but any meeting would happen on my terms at a location I chose, and they needed to come prepared with complete financial documentation and a realistic plan for James to become a contributing member of society. Dad agreed to everything way too quickly, which tells me exactly how desperate they really are. Update 2. The face-to-face meeting happened yesterday, and Reddit, I have been waiting 4 years for this moment, and it was everything I hoped it would be and more. They have no idea what's coming for them. We met at a restaurant I chose specifically because it's expensive enough that they'd feel uncomfortable, but not so fancy that we couldn't have a detailed conversation about their financial stupidity without drawing too much attention. I got there early and picked a table in the back corner where we could talk privately. I wore my best suit because I wanted them to see exactly how well I was doing. Dad and Mom walked in looking older and more tired than I expected, but James was with them, and that actually surprised me. This man showed up to a family financial meeting wearing a gaming t-shirt and jeans with holes in them, at 40 years old, to discuss his parents' medical and housing crisis. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. They sat down, and there was this awkward moment where nobody knew how to start. Finally, Dad cleared his throat and said he was glad we could all get together as a family to work things out. I told him to cut the family reunion act and show me the financial documents I'd requested. Dad pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. I spent about 10 minutes going through their bank statements, medical bills, mortgage information, and credit card debt while they sat there fidgeting. The situation was even worse than I'd suspected. They owe more on their house now than they did 15 years ago because of that home equity line of credit. Mom's medical expenses are running about $4,000 a month, even with insurance. Dad's pension covers maybe 60% of their basic living expenses, and that's without James contributing anything. I looked up from the papers and asked James directly what his plan was for contributing to the household finances. James looked at Dad like he expected him to answer for him. Dad started to speak and I cut him off, saying I asked James and I wanted to hear from James himself. James mumbled something about how he'd been looking into some opportunities, but the job market was tough for people his age. I asked him what specific opportunities he'd been pursuing and what his qualifications were. James said he had a lot of experience with technology and computers, and he was sure he could find something in that field once he got his resume together. I asked James when the last time he'd worked was. James said it had been a while, but he'd been staying current with technology trends. I asked him to be more specific about how long a while was. Dad jumped in saying James had been focusing on other priorities and job hunting was stressful for someone with his sensitivity. I told Dad to let James speak for himself since we were discussing James's plan for supporting the household. James finally admitted he hadn't had a formal job since 2007. 2017, years ago. This man has been unemployed for almost 2 decades and they're calling it sensitivity. I asked James what he'd been doing for income during those 17 years. James said his parents had been supporting him while he figured out his direction. I asked what direction he'd figured out after 17 years of thinking about it. James said the economy had been challenging, and he wanted to make sure he found the right fit instead of just taking any job. Mom jumped in defending James, saying he wasn't like other people and needed a supportive environment to thrive. She said James was highly intelligent and creative, but the traditional work world didn't appreciate people like him. I asked what creative projects James had been working on. Mom said James had lots of ideas, but he needed the right opportunity to showcase them. I turned back to James and asked him to describe one of these creative projects. James started talking about some video game concepts he'd been thinking about, and maybe starting a gaming channel where he could build an audience. I asked if he'd actually created any games or started any channels. James said he was still in the planning stages, but these things took time to do right. I put the financial papers back in the folder and told them their situation was exactly what I'd expected. I said they had a 40-year-old man living in their house who hadn't contributed anything financially in 17 years, medical expenses they couldn't afford, and a mortgage they'd use their house equity to secure additional debt against. I said this wasn't a temporary crisis, it was the predictable result of decades of terrible financial decisions. Dad got defensive and said they'd done their best to support their family, and sometimes life throws you challenges you don't expect. I reminded him that James living in their basement for 17 years wasn't something life threw at them. It was a choice they made to enable him. I said Mom's health issues were unfortunate but not unforeseeable, and they should have been planning for increased medical expenses as they aged instead of taking out more debt on their house. Mom started getting emotional and said they'd always tried to do right by both their sons. She said they'd given James a safe place to figure out his life because they believed in him. I asked her what evidence she had after 17 years that James was ever going to figure anything out. Mom said James just needed more time and the right opportunity. I told Mom that James had had more time to figure out his life than most people get in their entire careers. I said she wasn't helping James by enabling his complete avoidance of adult responsibility. She was destroying his chance to ever become a functional person. I pointed out that James was now middle-aged with no work experience, no skills, and no understanding of how the real world works. James got upset and said I didn't understand what it was like to be him, and that not everyone was cut out for the corporate world. He said some people were meant for different kinds of success. I asked James what kind of success he was meant for and what he'd accomplished that demonstrated this special destiny he had. James said I was being mean and judgmental, and that family was supposed to support each other. He said he helped around the house and provided emotional support to Mom and Dad. I asked him to specify what emotional support he provided by sleeping until afternoon and playing video games. James said I was twisting everything around and making him sound worse than he was. Dad interrupted and said we weren't there to attack James. We were there to figure out how to help the family through a difficult time. I told Dad that James was the difficult time and had been for 17 years. I said the reason they were in this financial mess was because they'd been supporting a grown man who refused to work for almost 2 decades while taking on additional debt. Dad said that wasn't fair and that James's situation wasn't the cause of their current problems. I pulled out my own folder and showed them a financial analysis I'd prepared. I walked them through exactly how much money they'd spent supporting James over the past 17 years, including food, utilities, car insurance, spending money, and the opportunity cost of the rent they could have charged for that basement space. The number was over $300,000. $300,000 they'd spent on a man who was capable of working but chose not to. I told them that if they'd invested even half that money instead of throwing it down the James hole, they'd have enough savings now to handle Mom's medical expenses without going into debt. Dad said you can't put a price on family and that James was worth more to them than money. I asked him if James was worth Mom losing her house and being unable to afford her medical care. Dad said that wasn't a fair choice to present. I told him it wasn't a choice I was presenting. It was the reality they'd created. Mom started crying and said they'd never meant for things to turn out this way. She said they thought they were being good parents by supporting James through his struggles. I asked her at what point during the past 17 years she'd planned to stop supporting James through his struggles and expect him to support himself. Mom said they kept thinking James would find his way and they didn't want to abandon him. I told her they hadn't been supporting James through a difficult period. They'd been enabling him to avoid growing up. And now all three of them were paying the price for their refusal to make him face reality. James started arguing that I didn't understand depression and anxiety and how hard it was for people like him to function in society. He said I'd always been different and couldn't relate to his challenges. I told James that everyone has challenges, and most people don't get to spend 17 years avoiding them while their parents pay all their bills. I asked James what he thought would happen to him when Mom and Dad died, and there was no one left to support his lifestyle. James said that was a horrible thing to think about, and he loved his parents. I told him love meant taking care of people, not living off them for 2 decades while they went into debt. Dad asked me to stop attacking James and focus on finding solutions. I told Dad the solution was simple, but none of them wanted to hear it. James needed to get a job, any job, immediately, and start contributing to the household expenses. They needed to sell the house and downsize to something they could afford. And they needed to stop pretending that 17 years of unemployment was a temporary situation that would resolve itself. Dad said they couldn't sell the house because it was their home and James needed stability. I told Dad that James had had 17 years of stability and used it to accomplish absolutely nothing. I said they were choosing to enable James's dysfunction over Mom's medical care and their own financial security. That's when I told them what I'd really come there to say. I explained that I'd been researching their situation very thoroughly over the past few weeks, and I'd discovered something interesting about their home equity line of credit. The bank that holds that loan was recently acquired by a larger financial institution that I happen to do significant business with. I told them I'd had some conversations with people I know in that bank's commercial lending division, and they were very interested to learn more about properties in their portfolio that might be better suited for redevelopment than continued residential use. I said their neighborhood was being looked at for potential commercial expansion, and properties with existing debt complications were particularly attractive for buyout offers. Dad asked what that meant, and I could see the panic starting to set in. I told him it meant that if their situation didn't improve significantly and quickly, they might find themselves dealing with some pressure from their lender to resolve their debt situation one way or another. Mom asked if I was threatening them. I told her I wasn't threatening anyone. I was simply sharing information about market conditions they should be aware of. I said banks don't like carrying risky loans on properties with borrowers who have declining ability to service their debt. I stood up to leave and told them they had exactly 30 days to show me a concrete plan for how James was going to start contributing financially to the household. I said if James didn't have a job and wasn't generating income within 30 days, I would have to assume they weren't serious about solving their problems, and I'd make my recommendations to my contacts accordingly. Dad asked what kind of recommendations. I told him the kind of recommendations that help banks make efficient decisions about problem properties. Final update. Reddit. What I'm about to tell you is the most satisfying thing that has ever happened in my entire life. 4 years of planning, and it all came together exactly the way I knew it would. The 30-day deadline came and went, and surprise, surprise, James was still unemployed. I knew they wouldn't take me seriously because they'd spent decades believing their dysfunction was normal and sustainable. They actually thought they could manipulate me the same way they'd manipulated each other for 17 years. 3 days after the deadline, Dad called me again. He tried to explain that James had been looking for work, but the job market was really competitive and they needed more time. He said James had submitted several applications and was waiting to hear back. I asked Dad to specify which companies James had applied to and what positions he'd applied for. Dad got vague and said James had been applying to various technology companies and some customer service positions. I told Dad to have James send me copies of his job applications and the responses he'd received. Dad said that was unnecessary micromanaging, and they just needed a little more time to get James situated. I told Dad that time was up, and I'd be making my recommendations to the bank that afternoon. Dad started panicking and said they'd done their best, but James was struggling with confidence issues after being out of the workforce for so long. I asked Dad how James's confidence issues were going to pay for Mom's medical care. Dad said they could figure something else out and maybe James could start with part-time work to build up his confidence gradually. I told Dad they'd had 17 years to build James's confidence gradually, and the result was a 40-year-old man who couldn't fill out a job application. I said I was done enabling their delusions. That afternoon, I had a very productive conversation with Robert Carson at the bank. Robert handles distressed properties and commercial redevelopment opportunities. I explained that I'd been monitoring a particular property that might be suitable for a mixed-use development project my firm was considering, and I'd noticed the property owners were having difficulty servicing their debt obligations. Robert was very interested because the neighborhood was indeed being looked at for commercial expansion, and properties with existing equity loans were always easier to acquire than clear title properties. I provided him with the address and suggested his team might want to review the account status and payment history. 2 weeks later, my parents received a formal notice that their home equity line of credit was being called in for full payment within 60 days due to concerns about their ability to service the debt. The letter explained that the bank's risk assessment had identified their property as a potential liability, and they needed to either pay the full balance immediately or begin foreclosure proceedings. Dad called me in a complete panic. He said they'd never missed a payment and couldn't understand why the bank was suddenly demanding full payment. I told Dad that banks reassess risk constantly, and apparently their situation had been flagged as unstable. I suggested he contact the bank directly to discuss their options. Dad said he'd already called the bank and they'd told him the decision was final, unless he could pay the full $78,000 they owed immediately. He asked if I knew anyone at the bank who might be able to help them work out a payment plan. I told him I might be able to make some inquiries, but I'd need to see a concrete plan from them first. Dad asked what kind of plan I wanted. I told him the same plan I'd been asking for all along. James needed to have a full-time job with documented income. They needed to sell the house and downsize to something they could afford. And they needed to stop pretending that 17 years of enabling James was somehow going to result in a different outcome. Dad said they couldn't sell the house because they'd lose money on it with the current market conditions and they didn't know where they'd live. I told Dad that was exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten them into this situation. I said they were choosing to lose the house to the bank instead of selling it themselves and controlling the process. Mom got on the phone and started crying, saying they'd built their whole life in that house and couldn't imagine living anywhere else. She said James needed the stability of his familiar environment, and moving would be traumatic for him. I asked Mom if she thought being homeless would be less traumatic for James than moving to a different house. Mom said I was being cruel and that there had to be another solution. She asked if I could just loan them the money to pay off the bank, and they'd figure out how to pay me back over time. I told Mom I wasn't running a charity for people who'd spent 17 years making terrible decisions. Dad took the phone back and asked what it would take for me to help them. I told Dad it would take James getting a job, keeping that job for at least 6 months, and contributing to the household expenses during that entire time. I said it would take them selling the house and moving somewhere they could afford without going into debt. And it would take all three of them acknowledging that their current situation was the direct result of enabling James's refusal to grow up. Dad said those conditions were unreasonable, and I was asking them to destroy their family to satisfy my ego. I told Dad I wasn't asking them to do anything. I was simply stating what would need to happen before I'd consider getting involved in their financial situation. I said they were free to handle their problems however they wanted. The foreclosure process moved forward exactly as I knew it would. James finally got a part-time job at a video game store, but he was making minimum wage for 20 hours a week, which worked out to about $400 a month after taxes. $400 a month when they needed $78,000 immediately. Mom's health got worse during the stress of losing the house, and she ended up needing round-the-clock care. They had to sell most of their belongings and move into a subsidized nursing facility that had a small apartment section for couples. James moved into a studio apartment nearby, but his minimum wage job barely covered his rent and food, so he was still asking them for money they didn't have. That's when they started the phone calls that I'd been waiting 4 years to receive. Dad called me from the nursing home and said they desperately needed my help. He said Mom's condition was deteriorating, and they couldn't afford the level of care she needed. He said James was doing his best but couldn't support them financially, and they had nowhere else to turn. He asked if I could find it in my heart to help them during their time of need. I told Dad I'd consider it, but first I wanted to have a conversation about our family history. I said I wanted him to explain to me exactly why he'd thought it was appropriate to call me a pathetic failure when I needed help, but now expected me to rescue them when they needed help. Dad tried to say that was different because they'd been stressed and overwhelmed back then. I told Dad they were stressed and overwhelmed now too, but apparently that was a reason for me to help them rather than a reason for them to figure it out themselves. I asked him to explain the difference. Dad said they were family, and families forgive each other and help each other through difficult times. I reminded Dad that he'd told me they weren't running a homeless shelter when I needed help, so why should I run a charity for them now? Dad said that wasn't the same thing because their situation was more serious. I asked Dad if he thought my situation hadn't been serious when I was recovering from an injury, going through a divorce, and losing my house. Dad said that was different because I was young and healthy and could recover from setbacks. I told Dad I was 42 years old when they kicked me out. Not exactly a kid with unlimited time to rebuild my life. Mom took the phone and said she was sorry for the things they'd said back then, but she was scared and in pain now, and just wanted her son to help her. I told Mom I was scared and in pain when she called me cursed and infectious, but that hadn't motivated her to help me. I asked why her fear and pain should motivate me to help her. Mom said she'd made mistakes, but she was my mother, and she'd always loved me even when she said cruel things. I told Mom that love doesn't involve telling your child they're a pathetic failure who infects your home with negative energy. I said love doesn't involve telling neighbors you can't stand the sight of your own son. Mom started crying harder and said she was dying and just wanted to make peace with her family before it was too late. I told Mom she'd had 4 years to make peace with her family, and she'd only become interested in it when she needed money. I asked why I should believe her desire for peace was genuine now, when it had never materialized during the years I was successful and independent. Dad got back on the phone and said I was being vindictive and that holding grudges was destroying my soul. He said the man they'd raised would never abandon his parents in their time of greatest need. I told Dad the man they'd raised had come to them for help during his time of greatest need and been told he was a cursed failure who needed to pack his things and get out within 48 hours. Dad said that was in the past and we needed to focus on moving forward together as a family. I told Dad that was exactly what I'd tried to do 4 years ago, but apparently moving forward together as a family was only important when they were the ones who needed help. I asked Dad if he remembered telling me that when I came crawling back dying and desperate, I shouldn't bother knocking because they only housed winners in their home. Dad went quiet for a long moment, then said he'd been angry and upset and didn't mean those things. I told Dad those were some very specific and cruel things to say to someone if you didn't mean them. Dad said he was sorry, and he'd been wrong to say those things. I asked Dad what had changed his mind about only housing winners. Dad said their situation was different and they genuinely needed help. I told Dad my situation had been different too, and I genuinely needed help, but that hadn't mattered to them. I asked Dad where James was during this crisis and why he wasn't taking care of them. Dad said James was doing his best, but he didn't have the resources to provide the kind of help they needed. I told Dad that was exactly the problem I'd been trying to explain to them for years. I said they'd spent 17 years enabling James to avoid becoming the kind of person who could help anyone, including himself. Dad said it wasn't fair to blame James for their current situation. I told Dad it was perfectly fair because they'd chosen to support James instead of building their own financial security, and Now they were all paying the price for that decision. I said they'd had thousands of opportunities to make James get a job and contribute to the household, but they'd chosen to enable his dependence instead. Dad asked what I wanted him to say and what I wanted them to do. I told Dad I wanted him to say exactly what he'd said to me 4 years ago. I wanted him to acknowledge that they weren't running a charity and that my money wasn't any good to them. I wanted him to remember that they only house winners and ask himself whether people who lose their home to foreclosure because they spent 17 years supporting an unemployed 40-year-old qualify as winners. Dad said that was cruel, and I was punishing them for mistakes they'd made when they were scared and overwhelmed. I told Dad I was simply applying the same standards to them that they'd applied to me. I said if those standards were cruel when applied to them, then they'd been cruel when applied to me too. I told Dad that I'd learned something important from them about how family relationships work. I said they'd taught me that when someone comes to you for help, you evaluate whether they deserve it based on their life choices and their contribution to the family. I said they'd taught me that love doesn't mean enabling people's dysfunction, and that sometimes you have to let people face the consequences of their decisions. I said I'd applied their lessons very carefully over the past 4 years, and my evaluation was that they didn't deserve help because they'd made terrible decisions and hadn't contributed anything positive to the family dynamic. I told them their situation was the direct result of their own choices, and they needed to figure it out themselves just like they'd expected me to do. Dad said that wasn't what they'd meant, and I was twisting their words. I told Dad those had been his exact words, and if he didn't like how they sounded when applied to him, he should have thought about that before saying them to me. Mom took the phone one last time and said please. She was begging me. She just needed to know that her son still loved her before she died. I told Mom I loved the woman who'd raised me, but that woman had disappeared the day she called me cursed and infectious. I said the woman on the phone was a stranger who'd treated me with cruelty I wouldn't show to my worst enemy. I told Mom she'd made her choice about what kind of relationship she wanted with me when she kicked me out and told the neighbors she couldn't stand the sight of me. I said I was simply respecting that choice and giving her exactly what she'd asked for 4 years ago. I hung up the phone, and I haven't answered any of their calls since. They made their choice when they decided a 40-year-old unemployed man living in their basement was more valuable than their son who was trying to rebuild his life after a divorce and injury. Now they get to live with that choice. They taught me that family helps family only when it's convenient, and love has conditions that can be revoked when someone becomes inconvenient. They taught me that cruel words said in anger reveal your true feelings, and that some bridges burn completely once you light them on fire. Most importantly, they taught me that the only person you can really count on is yourself, and that success is the best revenge against people who bet against you. I'm doing great, by the way. My business is thriving. I bought a beautiful house last year, and I sleep perfectly at night knowing that I learned the most important lesson of my life from the people who raised me.